Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Innovate for Cities Conference and the 7th plenary session for this conference. My name is Megan Tran, and I am one of your 3 MCs for this global yet local conference, hosted by the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy and UN Habitat, co-sponsored by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I'd like to acknowledge that the Innovate for Cities Conference will uniquely be taking place all over the world as people tune in from their different regions and lands that they're representing, which often happens to be the traditional territories of many Indigenous peoples. I personally will be presenting from the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. The meeting place of Toronto, also known as Takaronto, Canada, is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and is now home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. Before I hand it over to the host of this plenary session, I'd like to acknowledge the conference organizers and hosts for this Innovate for Cities conference, the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, and UN Habitat, as well as our co-sponsor, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I'd also like to thank our sponsors and partners, the Resilience First, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, Melbourne Center for Cities, UNESCAP, UNEP, UNDRR, Cities Alliance, Coalition for Urban Transitions, Urban Sustainability Directors Network, Urban Climate Change Research Network, World Bank, World Resources Institute, Future Earth, Student Energy, UNU, CDP, ICLEI Local Governments for Sustainability, OECD, IIED, Planners for Climate Action, Metropolis, and the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Thank you so much for guiding the organization of this event through the Partners Network Organizing Committee. We also want to acknowledge our amazing regional curator teams and our 500 strong presenters in 200 sessions who have ensured this global conference features the intersections of cities and climate change science with true local context, providing an important opportunity to review those gaps in knowledge and priority themes uncovered in the Global Research Action Agenda on Cities and Climate Action. Our Science and Innovation Steering Committee have overseen the conference's objectives and proceedings and will, alongside our writing and rapporteur teams and GCOM's Research and Innovation Technical Working Group, are helping to update the Global Research Action Agenda on climate change science by documenting all of these sessions. Importantly, the conference and its outputs will feed key messages into the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP26, as well as provide input for the 7th assessment report of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC AR7, a special report on climate change and cities. This conference has something for anyone interested in that intersection of climate change science and practice, and is an exploration of the current state of decisions needed to be made and the information, knowledge, data, and science available to help now and in the future. In the design of this conference, we have concentrated both of our efforts into a wide range of themes and voices engaged in innovation and transformation throughout the different sessions. However, we also acknowledge that certain fringe issues or voices might not always be represented. And so we'd like to encourage you to incorporate your views on these voices not heard in the conference content to the discussion boards and the surveys available in the Knowledge Center. So now I'd like to warmly welcome to the virtual stage our host for this plenary session, Barbara Buchner, who is the Global Managing Director of Climate Policy Initiative and Head of Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance.
Thank you so much, Megan. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you are logging in today. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, my name is Barbara Buchner, the Global Managing Director of Climate Policy Initiative, which holds the Secretariat of the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance. In case you're not familiar, the Alliance is a coalition of leaders from more than 75 institutions committed to deploy and finance for city-level climate action at scale. This session is occurring at a critical time. I think we all know that cities are at the forefront of climate change vulnerability, We've seen that 70% of cities are already experiencing harmful impacts to their citizens and infrastructure as a result of climate change. And on top of this, the COVID-19 pandemic has added further strain to cities, and the disruption continues to make planning for the future difficult. The ability of cities to meet their climate action ambitions is therefore as a critical juncture. And this leads me to the why we are here today. We are here today to discuss how to mobilize financing for urban climate action and sustainable urban infrastructure. And for this, the first question we must ask is, where do we stand today? Early this year, we released a report which is called The State of Cities Climate Finance, together with the World Bank and the Atlantic Council's Adrian R. Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center, which provides for the first time a comprehensive estimate of global urban climate finance flows and investment developed by tracking a broad range of sources of finance for climate adaptation and mitigation activities located in urban geographic areas or activities directly serving cities' dwellers. We estimated that a total of $384 billion was invested in urban climate finance globally in 2017-2018. This is far below the approximate $5 trillion needed annually. So this financing gap is particularly acute in regions such as South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, which saw an annual average investment of $4 and $3 billion respectively. And just in contrast, the investment opportunity estimated by the IFC is of $208 and $125 billion annually, respectively. So our findings are clear. There is an urgent need to finance and support climate action in cities, and while there is substantial investment in urban climate solutions, it still falls far short of the finance needed to bridge the investment gap in cities. But cities are ready to act. Over 6,000 cities covering 20% of urban residents globally have already developed climate action plans as part of the Global Covenant of Mayors network. They do, however, need far more project preparation and capacity building to turn these plans into implementable solutions. Cities need to be aware of and support with developing supportive innovative financing approaches and investment solutions that fill critical gaps in subnational finance. And cities must be prioritized at the national level with an emphasis on enabling frameworks to facilitate direct access of finance at the subnational level. It is critical to state that many of the solutions to the climate crisis in cities already exist. In fact, the Coalition for Urban Transitions estimates urban greenhouse gas emissions in cities can be reduced by almost 90% by 2050 with today's technologies and widely available measures. This would not only address climate challenges, but has the potential to support nearly 90 million jobs in the next decade. So with this in mind, we have an excellent panel today that can lend insight on how we can make this happen. But before we are getting into the panel discussion, it's my real pleasure to turn it over to Sami Waba, who is the Global Director of Urban Disaster Risk Management, Resilience and Land Use Practice at the World Bank, to provide opening remarks on the importance of enabling conditions for mobilizing urban climate finance. So Sami, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear Barbara, and it's a real pleasure for me to be here to join you and this distinguished panel of experts to discuss how do we really scale up mobilizing urban climate finance. I mean, it's a topic that we work very closely with the various partners around here, of course, with yourself, CCFLA, you and your team, with the various organizations, with UN Habitat, with the Global Covenant of Mayors, with the IPCC, and with the various public, private, and the international development community. And it's a topic that really is critical. So with that, let me start by giving maybe a framing presentation to provide some structure for today's conversation. And with that, I am going to share my screen. So take 1 second. Okay, so today the world is urbanizing at a really unprecedented scale and speed. So we're talking about 4.2 billion people living today in cities. That's about 55% of the total. And we expect to reach 68% of the world's urban population living in cities by 2050 by adding another 2.5 billion urban residents. Now, cities are under immense pressure to accommodate this influx of people. We're talking more or less about the population of Turkey, 84, 85 million, moving into cities every year between now and 2030. Now, we know that close to 90% of this new urban growth is going to happen in cities in both Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, and most notably in India and China. We also know that managing this urban expansion is especially critical for low carbon and resilient growth. In fact, most of this growth is expected to be seen in small to medium-sized cities with populations of less than 5 million inhabitants. And there are many varying estimates, to the scale of the infrastructure that's needed to secure for us a future that's low carbon and climate resilient, a future in terms of sustainable urban development. And these estimates range anywhere between, 1 to trillions per annum, just as you've mentioned, Barbara, up to 5 trillion per annum. So all what we know is that the figure is huge and it far exceeds what is currently being invested, as you rightly said that. Now, this presents us with a challenge, but also with opportunities. So to disentangle a little bit those two dimensions. So amongst our challenges, we have 1 billion people already living in slums today. We know that of the newly built up area that we need by 2050, at least half, if not more, is yet to be built. And of course, how this new urban expansion gets built will determine, in many ways, the future lock-in effect and what implications will have on both emissions and livability. We know that from the latest IPCC report, that urban areas will be particularly impacted by urban floods, by heat waves, by sea level rise. And therefore, how this future urban development is planned and how the management of these cities will also have a major impact on cities' population and their ability to adapt to climate change. We also predict that about 1.5 billion people, are expected to be exposed to cyclones and floods and disasters such as earthquakes and so on and so forth in the largest cities. So what is it that we are doing about this at the World Bank? Now, we launched this year our new climate change action plan for the next 5 years. Now, this plan sets how we are going to pursue our twin goals of poverty alleviation and achieving shared prosperity, meaning the reduction of inequalities, with a sustainability lens. So specifically, how are we going to align climate and development in all our operations so that we're Paris aligned by July 1st, 2023? Now, the plan also raises our ambitions as far as how much of our financing goes to climate change mitigation and adaptation. So we commit to achieving at least 35% in climate finance for the whole World Bank Group, and at least of that, 50% will be for adaptation. Now, the plan brings forward 5 key systems for transformation and transition, and these, of course, include cities, and alongside its transport, energy, agriculture, and manufacturing. Now, under the cities transition, we will be pursuing both climate resilient cities, so supporting cities in enhancing access to support the integration of risk in urban development, both in the planning and in the financing, and also low carbon cities. And again, here by supporting cities in greening their infrastructure and services, advancing green buildings, both public and private, and adopting the principles of integrated waste management and the circular economy. Now, to mobilize finance at scale, these are unprecedented times, and we know that cities are in the epicenter of we know that cities are in the epicenter of compounding risks and challenges, but also that they face significant opportunities. So just in terms of a quick broad brushstroke to look at the trends that are influencing cities' ability to mobilize urban climate finance at scale, we can quickly list, the impact of COVID-19 on city budgets, climate change, shocks on city budgets, rural-urban migration and the pressures that are resulting. And again, climate-induced migration is going to play a major factor. We've estimated that by 2050, if we do nothing about climate change, there'll be at least 200 million, it's closer to 216 million, I think, that will be climate-induced migrants. Of course, issues related to the planning and management of cities, and of course, the need for data in there. So if we want to delve further, it's important that we understand what cities have control over and what different roles a city government can play so that it can leverage urban climate finance. So in general, we look at cities as having 5 key roles through which they can leverage urban climate finance. And conceptually, you can characterize them in 2 buckets. On the left-hand side, these are the roles where the city government act as direct providers of infrastructure and services. So it's what the city pays for, basically. The goods and services it consumes, the goods and services it provides, and the capital it raises. On the other hand, on the right-hand side, it's the functions or roles where the city acts as a steward, so things that the city can influence. And this is through both regulation, urban planning, and the roles that it can play in terms of convening and championing systems level thinking. Now, specifically, this latter role, the steward role, is a key lever for cities and where there are lots of opportunities to mobilize urban climate finance. And I think that's one of our main messages in this report we've had jointly with CCFLA, is that it's not just about what the city can pay for. There's a lot that the city can do through its regulatory role, through its other functions that it can influence, via planning, etc. Now, beyond this, we also need to understand the interconnected layers of the enabling conditions or the enabling framework that plays a critical role in determining whether and where climate investment can be mobilized in urban areas. And that's irrespective of the sources of financing. So for starters, climate change affects all countries, but cities across the globe don't have the same starting point in terms of size, geography, capacity, autonomy, or wealth. So to be able to mobilize urban climate finance at scale, we need to start thinking at a systemic level to create enabling conditions. First, at country level, second, at city level, and then transcend and do that at the global level. But all of these need to work in the same directions. These are the 3 concentric circles that you see in this onion graph. So the slide presents to you a systems level framework on how we see interlinkages between enabling condition, the layers, and the city roles to mobilize urban climate finance. At the foundation, that's the largest concentric circle, is the country level enabling elements. So this includes national level governance. It includes the intergovernmental fiscal transfer system or fiscal system, the financing system of the countries. It includes the NDCs, and all of these determine the enabling environment with and dictate what a city can do in terms of planning, regulation, and financing. So that's the national enabling framework. The central level are the city level enabling elements. So on the left-hand side, you include basically city level planning processes that linked to finance. So it's the municipal finance system, it's the capital investment plan, it's the budgets that exist within a city. On the right-hand side, it's the non-municipal finance dimensions. So it's the broader planning instruments, like the strategic plan, the spatial land use plan, and it's the non-municipal finance systems that exist within a city. So what the private sector contributes, what the households contribute, and so on. And then nestled between those two is the layers, on the climate specific enabling elements. So that's the city level climate strategy, the climate project pipeline, and the climate specific revenue models. Yeah. So in addition, when you look at this graph, you'll find that on the left-hand side, of this onion, we're showing the role that a city government can tap into through what they pay for as either a direct provider of services or a consumer of goods and services. Okay. On the right-hand side, it's what they can influence as a steward, as a regulator, as a planner. And then for us to be able to scale and accelerate the dollars flowing to green activities in cities and the urban systems, we need really a whole of an economy approach where these enabling conditions at the country level, at the city level, and at, for the climate dimension, all to be working and reinforcing each other. Now, we also know that climate change affects rich and poor regions alike, and that cities have very starting differing points. On the one hand of a spectrum, you'll find city governments that have high levels of agency, of autonomy, of authority, capacity, and robust systems and mechanisms for service delivery. And on the other end of the spectrum, you'll find cities that are, whether they're poorer or they're in more fragile and conflict settings, that might have more limited agency or capacity or weaker intergovernmental fiscal systems or service delivery mechanism. But what's important to note that irrespective of whether they're on the one hand or the other hand of the spectrum, there are a lot of instruments that a city can deploy and think of, especially via the steward function, that would enable them to channel action for mobilizing finance for climate action. Now, lastly, I wanted to conclude by elaborating a little bit on what do we mean by mobilizing urban climate finance at scale. So we mean, one, thinking in terms of how we green all of the existing city finances. So in other words, we're increasing the green share of city finances. On a second level, thinking in how we find new sources of green finances towards cities. And that's increasing the size of the green path. And then lastly, in terms of thinking of how we ensure impact and actually address the needs of urban citizens to ensure that they have low carbon and resilient cities and all the co-benefits in terms of cleaner air, etc. And for us to do so, we really need a whole of an economy approach to enable and finance bold climate action in cities and in urban systems. That's greening and aligning existing urban finance systems and the intergovernmental architecture at the local and national levels. That's, if you will, the first one, increasing the share. Mobilizing new urban climate finance at the city level. And we have lots of examples in the report, like, for instance, think about, conditional intergovernmental transfers that are linked to climate action. Think about own source revenues, private markets, urban households that could contribute to urban climate action. And then lastly, strengthening the climate smart impact in both urban and capital investment planning systems. And that's things like green regulation and design standards, promoting compact cities and compact spatial form to prevent sprawl, reduce emissions from transportation, integrating dynamic greenhouse gas measurement, and pricing of carbon into investment planning decisions, and that's increasing the impact. So it's increasing the green share, increasing the pie, and increasing the impact. And with that, I would like to stop here and return it back to Barbara. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sami, for setting the scene really with this presentation here, both by sharing the key messages on the enabling conditions for urban climate finance, but also I think very nicely for bringing attention to the importance of aligning this country, city, and climate-specific enabling environments really by taking this systemic level framework, and then also really pointing to the importance of the whole of economy approach by really thinking more granularly about how to mobilize climate finance. So I think that was fantastic to get us started. And let's now dig deeper and also discuss some of the examples and the resources available with the panel. And Sami, don't go away. I will come back to you later in this discussion to make sure that we get more of your expertise and your reflections on the discussions. But let me now introduce my panel here. I'm very pleased to have with us Tatiana D'Aliejo, who is the Division Chief of Housing and Urban Development of the Inter-American Development Bank. Tatiana, it's great to have you. I'm very happy also to welcome Mauricio Rodas, who is the former mayor of Quito, and always wonderful to have you here with us, Mauricio. Then I'm very pleased to have here with us Emmanuel Maspredier, who is the Executive Director of the Urban Resilience Initiative and Fund focusing on Africa at Meridian. Welcome, Emmanuel. And last but certainly not least, it's a true pleasure to have with us today Vladislav Kaim, who is the Youth Advisor on Climate Change at the United Nations. So Vladislav, welcome to this discussion today. But let's jump into discussion here, and let me get started with you, Tatiana. And I think coming back a little bit what Sami said, we just heard that obviously in order to mobilize finance for low carbon cities at the scale needed, we need to really embed the strategic planning, special planning, and investment planning at the local and national levels to green the existing finance, which was the first by increasing the share, but leverage new sources of climate finance, which is the second, increasing the green pie, and then the third one, really increasing the impact of climate finance for cities. The third part of the mobilizing, really increasing the green impact. So how do you see the role of multilateral development banks like IDB in supporting this?
Thank you very much, Barbara, and thanks, Sami, for that excellent presentation. Barbara, as Sami was saying, cities play a critical role, or can play a critical role, not only achieving decarbonization objectives through making better energy use, reducing commutes, orienting mobility, all that through spatial planning. Better waste management and improve circular economies when we're looking at investments, but also, and I think going a little bit beyond decarbonizing, I think there is also great space for having better strategies for increased adaptation and resilience through, again, instruments of spatial and urban planning, which can integrate better green belts or natural buffers. Now, realizing such potential is not without challenges, and I wanted to maybe mention 4 areas which I think can hold a great potential, and which there's quite a few of the MDBs that are working on in order to increase maybe climate impact of the financing that is currently flowing, and at the same time increase the amount of green financing. And I think, just to summarize them, I would like to talk about maybe, integration, valuation and metrics. I would like also to talk about, budgeting, which Sami touched upon, and maybe results monitoring and reporting. And I think, as MDBs, we have to have a critical, screen, put through when we look into this. First of all, I think, many cities have done a commendable, job in preparing climate action plans. But unfortunately, in many instances, these plans did not actually integrate properly economic, spatial, and physical expansion or investment plans. I think to mainstream, climate action, coordination across sectors and administrations needs to be strengthened. And I think MDBs can play a critical role there. Firstly, through vertical integration of climate objectives, like, for instance, the NDCs, but also at horizontal level, for example, amongst administrations working in metropolitan areas whose actions are often not coordinated, for instance, in the areas of transport or flood management. And secondly, through actions that integrate cities also to their immediate environment, and which can be much more effective than simply, looking at the immediate administrative boundaries. And there I'm thinking about junk functionalities or paying for ecosystemic services like coastal protection or flood management or land conservation, which in the long term, can be more effective. The second area, which is the area of valuation and metrics, I wanted to mention that while many cities have conducted greenhouse emission, inventories and vulnerability assessments, and many others are still to conduct it, agreement over the economic and financial value assigned to green infrastructure, nature-based solutions, or even biodiversity solutions still remains, an area for agreement. On the other hand, when prioritizing investments, while MDBs have, a common finance metric for their projects, it's just the MDBs having these finance metrics. Most countries, most cities don't have an agreed common system. And this brings me to my third point, which was the point on climate-based budgeting at both national and subnational level, and which assigns, should assign a specific criteria and priority to climate investments. For those cities which, are relatively financially independent, I mean, and, as Same was saying, these instruments are already, working well. I think that, they need to incorporate, criteria that, is specifically climate-based at the time of preparing their budgets. For cities which, are heavily dependent on transfers, this is even more important. And I would say that, there is a huge potential on enabling, vertical integration and alignment with the NDCs through appropriate, national budgeting. IDB has a climate for a platform for climate for ministers of finance, which was created under Vision 2025, and which seeks specifically to support ministers of finance applying horizontal coordination activities, but which has the potential for also going into vertical objectives. And lastly, and I'm aware that I don't want to take too much time to let my other co-speakers go ahead. I wanted to talk about the fact that measuring the impact of climate finance requires for cities to monitor, evaluate, and report efforts that allow us to link their actions, their investments, their budgeting to specific climate objectives and to see changes over time. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tatjana. I think that was really fantastic, really showing specifically how MDBs can help both to strengthen the climate action, the city's climate action plans, both to really help on the language, which I think is extremely important around the metrics and evaluation, but also really thinking about how it can help the ministers of finance, the national, really kind of national government to enable vertical alignment with the NDCs and ultimately certainly the measurement and the links to the specific areas where investments are most needed in cities. I think very important points that you made here, and I'm sure we're going to come back to some of those later in the discussions. But with that, let me actually now go directly to the other side, to the city's perspective, and really try to understand, Mauricio, from your side. I think you have seen and heard firsthand that COVID has had an impact on city budgets in many cases, and many countries are implementing recovery packages. So just in your experience as a former mayor, what can city governments do to help ensure recovery finance is really used to build back or forward greener, more resilient cities? So Mauricio, over to you.
Barbara, it is great to be part of this panel with so many good friends and great experts on this field. So thank you for the opportunity. Yes, I mean, cities have been, like Sami and Tatiana have mentioned, cities have been at the forefront of dealing with different crises, including, of course, COVID-19. Cities have been the first respondents to the COVID-19 crisis. And of course, that have made a huge impact on their budgets. We've seen, an amazing tax revenue reduction in cities. We've seen how inequalities have deepened in cities. We've seen record levels of unemployment. We've seen how health costs have risen. And of course, cities in most cases were not prepared to face such a challenge. Now, it is true that multi-trillion dollars recovery packages have been set up around the world, but according to a study developed by the WRI and the Coalition for Urban Transitions 1 year ago, only 7% of the total money from those stimulus packages went to sectors that are relevant for cities. So unfortunately, we are not seeing that money coming into cities to support their efforts, not only to deal with this particular crisis, but also to start building their resilience towards future shocks that we know are going to happen in the years to come. So what can cities do in this regard? I think that, and Tatiana mentioned this, and I think that's a very important point. Fortunately, many cities now do have a climate action plan. So it is good time to go and take a look at those climate action plans in order to rethink the way cities will be developing, providing goods and services towards the future for a build back better strategy. And having those climate action plans is certainly a very useful and helpful tool. We need to foster the development of these kind of plans in cities that have not been able to develop those yet. I am thinking particularly about medium-sized and small cities that have not had the support from, let's say, city networks or multilateral development banks or UN agencies because of many reasons. So we should be thinking about medium-sized and small cities because those are the ones that will be growing the most during the next years in terms of population. So we have to pay attention on the kind of institutional capacities these cities have, which unfortunately are not very strong. And again, since we will be witnessing such an important population growth there, we need to provide them with technical tools to also think about how they will be developing climate resilient projects in there. How would they be able to access to international financing? How can we support them for having project preparation capacity, even though there are very important efforts right now, like the GAP fund and others for project preparation facilities. There's still a lot to be done in terms of supporting cities for the early stages of projects in terms of capacity building at the institutional level. I also think that even though COVID-19, of course, was a huge crisis, it also was an interesting opportunity for cities to rethink themselves. And I think that even though we can talk a lot about recovery packages being set up by national governments, we also be thinking about how to engage the private sector in a more meaningful way, how to attract private investment into cities. And I think that cities in many regions of the world, particularly in the developing world, face the obstacle of dealing with very complex, cumbersome, and difficult to implement regulatory frameworks to develop public-private partnerships. And this is an area in which I think multilateral banks, international organizations can be pivotal for supporting cities, for example, by developing benchmark exercises to identify best practices, success stories that can be replicated to improve regulatory frameworks at the national level for cities to attract private investment in a much better way. I think, again, COVID-19 has to make us think in a very innovative way. And I think that, thinking outside of the box, like, for example, on things regarding private investment in cities can be meaningful. Also, and this is my last point, I think it has been really interesting to see mayors around the world taking a great leadership role, in some cases even more so than national governments, but taking bold, disruptive measures to protect their populations from COVID, but also to engage the community in an effort to think about the future. And there are great examples of that. For example, one of them is, of course, Buenos Aires. The city of Buenos Aires developed very interesting community engagement initiatives to open dialogue about how the city should be looking like in the future after this crisis. How the public sector, the private sector, NGOs, the community in general can work together by defining the kind of city they want to have in the future. What are the key areas in which the city government should be focusing on? What are the key areas in which the private sector should be focusing on? So again, I think this is the kind of things that a city can work on right now as a post-COVID era, and of course, keep advocating for receiving or for having better access to international financing. And that's why I think this kind of spaces to discuss the ways in which cities can improve their accessibility to finance are so relevant. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Marisa. I think lots of really important points on what a city can do today in order to really kind of build forward, build back better. And I think, again, kind of coming back to what Tatiana, but also Sami said before, the importance of these climate action plans, but really to help foster basically also the development of these plans in the cities that have not yet developed those. I think it's very important to think about these medium-sized and smaller size cities and how to make sure that there is actually capacity building and more project preparation support that can really help them kind of access the national finance, but also come up with the more innovative solutions that can address some of the needs that they have. And I think this brings me to one point that you made, and a very nice bridge to the next intervention that we'll hear. As you said, like how to engage the private sector. Obviously, no one better than Emmanuel to tell us, what the private sector thinks about these issues. We all know private capital is an important and really critical source for urban climate finance, but it obviously will depend on the enabling environment and the level of development also of the specific city. So just in your opinion, what is really kind of the most important element, what needs to be in place, and then, also what's maybe some of the biggest barriers that you see at the moment that limit some of the flows of private capital towards urban climate finance? So Emmanuel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you for having this invitation to join this panel. I will just start by saying that I fully agree with what has been just said. What is the most important thing is that we all recognize the critical role played by the city today, and the private sector is fully aware of that and want to see how we can better engage with the public sectors to create new type of partnership. And I think it's really the key word. How do we want to work together to gather resources and effort to make it happen? So we know that one of the key challenges that the city is currently facing is the development of new type of infrastructure which can help to serve the new needs of the community. And today it's even more complex because it's a growing need, and it's extremely complex due to the fact that you need to develop infrastructure which can serve the community on a long-term basis, which means to serve the current needs, but also to be able to adjust the infrastructure to face the next challenges that the city will face. And again, here I fully agree with what has been said. The critical part and the starting point is to have a clear development plan and priorities at the city level. And a lot has been done over the last 2 to 3 years, and even more today, as you just said, post-COVID. There is a clear priority list and defined at the city level. So look at the various resilience plan, development plan. The situation is well understood because that's come from the cities, the layer who knows quite well the needs of the communities. So it's important for all the actors, the private sectors, the multi-development banks, the national one, to look at this plan, to see the priorities, and to think about the best way to implement such type of project which will fit the requirement of the communities. And then when you look at the numbers of projects that are prepared, you realize that more than 80% of the project will not pass the planning phase. So they will fail during the planning phase of the project. And an additional 50% will never achieve the financial close. So we have to tackle this issue at this stage, which is the preparation phase of the project. And for being able to do so, I fully agree again with what has been said. We need to provide much more in terms of technical resources, expertise, financial resources, but at an early stage where you will prioritize, design, and prepare a project with the city and for the communities. That doesn't mean that the city will have to provide all the financial means and tools, but this is just a way for us also to identify the key stakeholders. We will work together and create this new type of partnership. And I think the key word today is partnership, and a new type of partnership which can be at an early stage, which can gather the various stakeholders, but with a critical decision power given to the city, which can say what they want. And they can also organize what they need to cover their community needs. That doesn't mean that they have to provide financial resources, but they have to be clear about what they want to have, clear about the objective. I also share the view that if you want to attract private money, especially impact fund, new green type of funding, you need to be able to measure the impact you are targeting and the positive impact in terms of resilience and climate change you would like to focus on. That will give much more visibility, and that provide the private sectors some measurement that they will use to deploy their funding capacity. There are a lot of new initiatives, new bucket of funding. What is needed is to identify the role and what can be provided. That will also help the private sectors and the investors to have a better understanding on the perception of risk. One of the key issues is the perception of risk. So that can be discussed. Is that right or no, or not right? This is not for me the key question. It's a perception. So you have to provide solution. And solution has to be provided by a combination of mechanisms, including risk-sharing mechanism, in order to start the process and for the private sectors to realize the real level of risk that this type of infrastructure embedded. But first, you need to structure some solution which can be effective. So, and an additional point which has been also mentioned is by partnership, we need also information sharing, expertise sharing, capacity building, in order to have this partnership, with this partnership, the capacity to develop the resources at the city level, which can be, again, on the technical aspect of the project, and also to define the pilot cases and the best use and the best solution to be implemented. And also, which is another key element for me, by partnership, we need to focus on additionality. So additionality, it's what will be the key driver of an efficient partnership. It's when all the stakeholders can provide what they have and can add all together some additional components on the delivery of the project. Additionality is for all of us at the various layers that Sameh clearly explained, multinational, national, local, city, and private sectors, to provide some means to attract further funding, to attract new players, and to do in a much more, and to increase the size that Sameh was mentioning. So additionality, it's for me also a key element to and the signaling effect that you can prepare efficiently a project, you can deliver a project, and you can attract much more money to a single project by having a programmatic approach at the city level, which means that to do it step by step, but in an integrated manner. So it's for me the key word, how to build new type of partnership, not only on the PPP type of partnership, but based on trust, share of expertise, share of know-how, and common alignment of interests.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Emmanuel. I think that it's fantastic to see some kind of common threads already emerging in this conversation here. Certainly this importance of the clear plans and the priorities, but also this importance of the early stage, like technical resources, expertise, financial resource. But I think what you said really certainly can be summarized in the importance of new types of partnerships and just really making sure that additionality is driving those. But also a little bit what Sameh said before, like really thinking about this more programmatic, this like whole of a economy, whole of a ecosystem approach that really will allow us to attract the private sector more. And I still think that innovation is very much core to all that, like what you said, like how can we come up with the solutions that really are, basically bringing the different parts of partners together. And I'd love to dive a little bit more into in our second round. But with that, let me actually now move to you, Vladislav, and what we've just heard from Emmanuel is it's really important to have at that very early stage partnerships with critical decision power given to the cities. And obviously the youth movement is a mobilizing force for a very strong climate change ambition and also a growing consumer base, including in cities. So love to hear your perspective of what are the types of services young people may be asking from their city leaders, which then I think can come back to some of the clear plans and the partnerships that can emerge from those. So the floor is yours, Vladislav.
Thank you very much, Barbara. It is great that in the discussions and contexts like this, we finally have also a smidge of a youth perspective at the table. And this is a great progress. But when it comes to the situation on the ground, so to speak, in the cities themselves, it is important to emphasize that the youth, they are among the most entrepreneurial individuals, be it through their contribution through startups or in an informal sector, through micro and small enterprises, or in their nonprofit activism, because many of the organizations, they are based in cities, most of them, they operate on no or very small budgets, and running them and providing an impact that actually matters requires in turn a lot of entrepreneurial spirit. But unfortunately, there is no sense of urgency among policymakers, among urban leaders, to invest in youth the same way they invest in physical infrastructure. There is a lot of talk when it comes to infrastructure on the physical part of it, and rightfully so. But people are making the cities. And many of those people, particularly in the developing world, are youth. And so when it comes to investing in infrastructure, in climate resilient infrastructure, investing in cities that are fit for the new climate era, we need to invest in youth, because the return on that investment will supersede any expectations. As I said, the entrepreneurial mindset that we are forced to have in order to cope with the climate crisis and its ongoing consequences, it is something that we would like to see in the actions of the urban leaders as well. And it is extremely important that apart from the recognition in name of the growing importance of youth engagement, there should be a recognition in budgeting. That comes both to the support of startup ecosystems that are related to clean tech, to green innovations, but also to the support of community networks and organizations that are, through their engagements, leading the local and hyper-local efforts, particularly in the context, as it was mentioned, in underserved communities, mostly clustered in the most sprawling cities, but also where the infrastructure is the least adapted for that, in Southern Asia or in Sub-Saharan Africa, in order to make sure that this lifeblood of community engagement, when it comes, what that makes the cities resilient, has a proper feed, so to speak, in order to assure that they are provided with the resources that they deserve. Through our engagements in our localities, we have proved multiple times, through multiple years, that even the slightest investment in us and in our engagement pays off for generations to come, because through the point of from which we think about and conceptualize and implement our version of climate action, we have to employ a multi-generational thinking in terms of impact. And so essentially directing more investments into youth, both on an entrepreneurial side of things, but also on the community engagement side of things, it is akin to issuing a 50 or 60-year-long interest-free bond to us, except where in this issuance both get a coupon and the environment does too. And this is the message I would like to convey in this regard. Invest in youth that lives in urban centers and in urban cores, particularly in their underserved communities, with the same urgency and with the same degree of prioritization that you invest in physical infrastructure, because without happy and engaged and feeling secure people, particularly youth in the cities, no other investments will pay off.
Thank you so much, Vladislav, and I think for really making an incredibly important point. I think we all agree, and already before, I think what I've heard a lot is like there needs to be more capacity building. Ultimately, what all that means is more investment into people. And I think what you just said, like obviously, youth is like the backbone of the cities of tomorrow. So I think having more investments in youth, in people, in particular the underserved communities, I think is an incredibly important part. Certainly, also what I've seen in my work is that there is a lot of youth behind all the innovations that we're seeing also on the financial side. So I think this is exactly where we need to get more and where we need to encourage entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs, to continue to work with us. So thanks so much for sharing your thoughts with us. But let me now come to you, Andy. And I think coming back a little bit to what Sami said before, he very nicely outlined the different roles that the city government can play, both in terms of the provider and the steward, as Sami has called it. So I'd love just to hear from you a little bit more. What types of roles have you seen cities leverage successfully, and what are some of the more innovative ways to help mobilize urban climate finance? So Andy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Barbara. And it's either the pleasure or the difficulty of going last in the first round. So I have plenty to build on, but then others have already covered some points that I would have made. I would just say in response to some of the points that Vladislav made, then have been working on a pilot youth policy innovation team with the Global Covenant of Mayors that build on some work that we've been doing last year, and very much looking forward to the release of the Global Youth Energy Outlook at COP26. Very interested to see what that says from a youth perspective about the role of cities, and follows on very much from some of those comments that were just made. And just very quickly to Mauritia's point about building on that data and understanding, not just of the citywide climate action plans, but the individual projects are coming forward. Then I feel like I'm trailing a lot of things that are then coming in more detail in a few weeks' time, but also at COP26, then the annual Global Covenant of Mayors impact aggregation report will also be released. And there we'll say a little bit more about some of the reporting that cities have been doing about the projects that they want to advance towards investment. So some of the annual reporting that cities are doing is not just on progress on emissions reduction, but there are questions in some of the reporting around the types and kinds of projects that cities do want to advance and take forward for investment. And we'll be bringing forward some overarching analysis that starts to set that out a little bit more clearly. And to your point about the different roles that cities can play, I'll make a shameless plug for the knowledge hub of the City Climate Finance Gap Fund, and I'll post the link in the chat and we'll make that available during this session. Some fantastic resources there that are helping to set out some of these different roles that cities can play. So for example, when it comes to the role of urban planning, there is a primer on urban form and greenhouse gas emissions, and a number of case studies within that. But for example, we've seen work in Mexico City around planning at urban scale to try to prevent further urban sprawl, and clearly a key role for local governments around the world to make those strong links between the kind of urban planning system to integrate both climate risk but emissions reduction potential into those urban plans, and then to advance the projects that are then coming forward both in conjunction with private sector developers but also publicly led projects, then to take those forward for implementation and investment. And so some real opportunities there to make very strong links to that urban planning system, and then to the enforcement of that, both through planning regulation, but even down at individual building level through the way in which building regulation and building controls are being used. And we've seen both a number of national jurisdictions, but even in individual cities introducing requirements around both climate and energy, but also kind of comfort for those buildings that are regulated through the formal planning system to try to address those issues. Then clearly a role for local governments on regulation, and a role in mandating kind of certain requirements, and again a separate report also on the Knowledge Hub from REN 21 around renewable energy in cities, and for example a great example from the city of Jakarta there around mandates to require the installation of solar energy through PV panels on large public buildings, so including kind of schools, hospitals, other government buildings, sports facilities, and so on. And it's really helped to stimulate growth in the rooftop PV market and the generation of solar power in that city. And again, variants of those kind of requirements, you know, whether it is renewable energy driven or again on the energy efficiency side, a number of authorities looking to play that role and where appropriate, and in particular trying to use public buildings and the public sector as anchor clients or anchor loads, then using those regulations and mandates to make those requirements. And then thirdly, and Sami also mentioned the role on kind of collective power and convening. And we've seen, for example, approaches in Argentina through RAMCC, and then a financial mechanism to kind of mutualize costs for climate action projects for smaller and medium-sized municipalities. And so there are now tools to increase the impact of individual cities' work by mutualizing those through a financial mechanism that's then linking them together. And really that kind of convening power and work between like-minded authorities looking to progress climate action within an individual country can be another role. we're also starting to see, for example, in a similar vein, attempts to engage individual, very small scale kind of individual or household level investors through crowdfunding and other platforms, and many of those being convened and managed by local government, in that case kind of looking to extend the power to generate new sources of revenue and finance. They're just a very few kind of very specific examples and case studies, but all of them referenced there and in that material that's on the Gap Fund website, but very clear that local governments are looking to fulfill multiple of those roles in rapidly advancing implementation of climate projects.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Andy, for sharing both the information and the knowledge up, which certainly we very much appreciate, but also kind of coming up with some concrete examples of what governments do and what can be done. And I'd love in the next round, and I'm going to ask my panelists to be a little shorter in the next round as we are going towards the end of the session, but I'd love in the next round just to go a little bit deeper into maybe some of the innovative financial instruments that you're working on as well. But let me come back, Tatjana, to you now and just very briefly get from you a perspective of what you think going forward should be some of the key priorities of MDBs, again, based on what you said before around the 4 areas, but what do you think should be the key priorities of MDBs to facilitate urban climate finance at scale?
Thank you, Barbara. No, going back and maybe, a little bit more rapidly. Talking about scale, I think, it's very important to think about, tools that are made accessible to cities to be able to scale up, and also access to resources. And there, I think, that MDBs, have different options. First of all, MDBs have typically supported cities through their national governments with sovereign guarantee instruments. And we do so mainly through either programs with specific incidents in cities with direct loans to national entities that they are passed on, loans to subnational entities with a sovereign or a national guarantee, and then thirdly, sometimes through financial intermediaries, like could be a development bank. Many of the MDBs have flagship programs, like IDB had, the Sustainable Cities, Emerging and Sustainable Cities program. The World Bank has the Sustainable Cities and Communities program, or EBRD has the Green Cities. Now, I think, what we need is to actually further action through NDB so that, there is greater access to funds, but also greater capacities. So at government level, I think that beyond, maybe having more money available at national level, what I think is important is to try to, bring down, the access to finance at subnational level. And there, I would say that, there's great possibilities in, increasing, finance directly through sub-sovereign lending, which, is more expensive than, sovereign lending, let's be honest, but which, so far has been relatively, small, and, which is to a certain extent, less linked to, certain affinities, or priorities defined at national level. EBRD has done it, but, it's been almost like, almost the exception. And it's also important to support cities being able to access capital markets, for instance, through guaranteeing emissions of sub-sovereign green and sustainable bonds, like, City of Mexico did a few years ago. To get the cities to be able to do all these, we, however, have to build our capacities. And for that, I think MDBs, have traditionally, done so, but there is much more to do in terms of, being able to strengthen fiscal and financial management capacities, as well as structuring capacities, structuring finance. And in this way, also, bringing up their credit worthiness and, their perception of risk that, Emmanuel mentioned earlier on, from the private sector. I think we have to help them also, prepare bankable projects, which are more green and socially inclusive. We have to help, city level reforms, as well as in some cases, national level reforms, normative or regulatory. And last but not least, in terms of capacity, I think it's very important to strengthen technical capacities to allow not only for sound operational efficiencies, which we have done for a very long time, but also to monitor and comply with climate mitigation and adaptation commitments that I was mentioning in my previous intervention. that, from the public government side, I think there's a lot to be done from the private sector side. And just to mention, a couple of things very quickly, mention that, I think we have to have greater collaboration between public and private sectors in niche areas, not only areas which, we have common commitment, like, for instance, the housing area, but also some others, like, for instance, insurance, where, the private sector has a particular effective set of tools that cities need to access. And last but not least, just my last sentence, I think, there is a great opportunity in continuing blended finance, which, can support areas which, are, have financial returns which are more feeble and, maybe less attractive at the onset. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tatiana. Very valuable pointers. I'm going to try to integrate them all in my summary, but with that, let me directly go to Mauricio and just ask you, Mauricio, what do you think should be some of the priorities for national governments to support cities to really make sure that we really can get to urban climate action and finance at scale? So Mauricio, over to you.
Well, I think the first thing that national governments should realize is that they will not ever meet the NDCs and the Paris Agreement goals without cities, right? Without an effective role from cities. So if countries want to, accomplish that goal, they need to work with cities. And in order for cities to do what they have to do to tackle climate change, they need to develop a huge infrastructure transformation, which demands a lot of financial resources, right? A lot of financial resources that, as of today, are very difficult to access for cities because we are dealing with an international financial architecture that was designed for countries, not for cities. And we need to make it more cities friendly. And I acknowledge very important efforts on the part of multilateral development banks like the IDB or the World Bank into developing different kinds of financial facilities for cities to have direct access to resources. But at the end of the day, we need to also understand that multilateral development banks are governed by national governments. I mean, we have ministers of finance sitting on the boards of multilateral development banks. So I think that it is really important to make the case that these institutions, which at the end of the day are governed by a national government perspective, need to accommodate those interests also by supporting cities, because without cities, it will be impossible to meet the kind of climate change goals that as a world we have, right? Which are translated in the Paris Agreement. So that's the one thing. And I think there are ways to do that. So one of the ways to do that for me is, for example, by coming up with a good governance structure for national development banks lending policies to cities. And there are some very interesting and positive examples of that out there. Colombia is one of them. I think that FINDETER, the National Development Bank from Colombia, receiving money from development banks, have established certain good criteria and policies to disperse that money into cities for climate-related projects. So that's the kind of thing that we should be looking at, right? Understanding that these international organizations are being governed by a national government perspective. That's how it works, right? But there are some ways in which national governments, with the support from these international organizations, can come up with mechanisms for these resources to be dispersed into cities, by understanding that countries need cities to meet the Paris Agreement and to meet their NDCs. And I finally, I want to recall what Vladislav mentioned during his intervention, which I really liked, and I sympathize with the idea of engaging the youth for having cities becoming a driver for our climate goals. You remember I mentioned during my first intervention how certain cities develop very interesting mechanisms for community engagement. So let me go back to the example that I mentioned, Buenos Aires. Buenos Aires had a program called Nuestros Mayores, working with the elderly to connect them with the youth for supporting them on everyday tasks like, you know, going to the grocery store or taking the dog for a walk during COVID. And that meant a very interesting community engagement channel between the elderly and the youth. That's the kind of thing that cities should also be thinking about.
I think that's great, Maurice, and I think thanks so much for sharing it. But I think really kind of changing probably also in how we communicate with governments or with other actors, really kind of, again, coming back to this critical importance of cities and helping them to achieve their goals. So I think that's really fundamental. So thanks so much for that. But over to you, Emmanuel, just try and get your kind of views on priorities, or maybe some of the examples that you have, or one example that you have that on an innovative business models that really can help basically to unlock private capital in cities.
Sure. So as you may know, within Meridiam, so we are infrastructure asset manager for new infrastructure delivered for the communities, and we have been selected as the asset manager of the International Municipal Investment Fund, which is created by the Malaga Coalition and which is dedicated for cities. So with UNCDF, UCLG and FMDV, we will focus on the deployment of a new initiative which is for Africa and which is more globally part of our Urban Resilience new initiative. This is an initiative which is dedicated for cities. We have set up a different vehicle for this initiative. The first one being a catalytic capital fund, which will be there to finance feasibility studies, additional elements to enable the public authorities and the municipality to decide the type of project they want to deliver and the way they want to deliver it. So it's really for us as a private sector to support the local authorities and the public authorities in the prioritization and preparation of the project. And for that, we have gathered some funding from DFI, but also from foundation. So this was the first element of the platform, which will be mobilized to prepare the project. And we have a second element in the platform, which is an investment fund, which will provide a layer of capital for this project, which has been developed and prepared to enable the private sectors to know that the project is well prepared, but it's also viable, and to unlock and to attract new investors coming from the private sectors. And this is a fund which is a blended finance fund. We have DFI, we have first loss protection in order, again, to assess the perception of risk from the commercial investors. We want to maximize the amount that we will be able to deploy, so which means that we provide this blended finance structure to have the capacity to provide cities and in new infrastructure with affordable source of funding to develop infrastructure. And then we have a commitment to measure the impact thanks to resilience KPIs that we have developed with the Rockefeller Foundation based on all their resilience plan initiative. So we have reviewed all this plan, what's a tremendous work which has been done with the C40, the resilience initiative, and all the network of the cities. And together, we embedded this resilience dimension at each single stage of the development of the project, and we measure it. And we have some KPIs in order to demonstrate that we are there from a financial perspective and return perspective, but also for the non-financial dimension for our investors. So preparation, blended finance, dedicated to cities in order to have much more sustainable new infrastructure on three main areas: mobility, energy transition, and social infrastructure, i.e. access to healthcare and education for communities, including also the commitment to have at each stage of the process the main stakeholders of the community involved in the decision-making process. So this is what is TURF and NMF.
Sure. Yes, I think that's probably we should try to share that in the chat, because I think it's a really exciting attempts on really addressing this perception of risk, and in this way unlocking private capital by bringing together different pools of capital, but also focus on measuring impact, which I think is so important. So thanks so much for sharing that. But Ladislav, let me just ask your quick kind of preference or priority of what you think youth movement actually could do to help mobilize urban climate finance.
First of all, youth climate movement can help mobilize urban climate finance by contributing with its experience and expertise in targeting the particular needs that need to be financed. When it comes to youth climate engagement, there is a lot of talk about the external side of what is seen or visible in youth activism, but there is not much talk about what is the output of it. But the output of it is creation of its own body of independent expertise, which needs to be leveraged and applied, because without it, the decisions reflect only a certain, however big, but only a certain pool of expertise and decision-making attributes. While in mobilizing urban climate finance that is not only good at scale, but also at the point of application, we need to make sure that this image and functionality of a green city has at its core an ethos of a city that works intergenerationally, in which intergenerational work is at the core of the decision making when it comes to defining the projects and the specs of those projects, which we will attract climate finance for in our urban environments. Thus, for me, from the perspective also for my conversations and my experience to work with many colleagues in the youth climate movement, I think this is where we can make the most impact, particularly when, if we come to look critically at it, that body of independent expertise that we accumulated through our engagement, it was accumulated first and foremost because this is where the politicians, the urban leaders could not even acknowledge the existence of a gap, lest actually mitigate it. That's why it is extremely important that in this intergenerational work, we meet each other halfway.
Absolutely. I think that's very well said, Vladislav, and very much look forward to hearing more from you and seeing how we can all work together to making this happen. But let me come back to Andy. And Andy, I am so sorry. I realized I think I forgot to introduce you. I think everyone knows you, but let me properly introduce you before I give you the final word. Obviously, Andy Deacon, who is the acting managing director at the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. I'm sorry, we clearly are interacting very often. So I kind of thought like everyone is aware, but Andy, let me come back to you and just get your view of what are some of maybe the bold ideas or innovative instruments that you think could really make a difference in scaling urban climate finance.
Thanks, Barbara, and no problem at all. And I'm actually going to pay you the compliment back the other way by stealing shamelessly from your work with one slide, if I may. Then, as part of the State of Cities Climate Finance report, obviously led by you and your team and collaborators from the World Bank, and I know a number of people who are listening into this session then also contributed to this fantastic work. And I've been tweeting on social media while we've been talking. If you haven't had a chance to look at the State of Cities Climate Finance report, latest edition, then absolutely do so. That really does set out not only the overview and the landscape, as we heard from Sami, but then very much more of the detail, both around some of the enabling conditions, but then also on some of these individual, more innovative financial instruments and the way in which they're being thought about and used by cities. But really what this graph tries to show is that as others have mentioned, not all cities are coming from the same starting place, and really opportunities, capacity, capability, the relationship between an individual city and their national government, and the way in which that can kind of both enable or block some of that progress as you mentioned yourself, Barbara, the state and status of a citywide climate action plan, and whether that's there as an underpinning element can all kind of influence the enabling environment that's there. But really, as the extent of city autonomy and capacity increases, then really opportunities to introduce more innovative instruments. There's some very exciting work happening around the role of green bonds, and we've seen some of the larger European cities, much more developed, but develop very large green municipal bond offers covering both emissions reduction, but as we've seen, for example, in Copenhagen and in Paris, then also addressing the resilience side of things as well, and opportunities for others, just to look at opportunities around green municipal bond issuance, I think will be an interesting topic that will get a little bit of the spotlight in the next little while. Others have talked about offering incentives or the role of public-private partnerships, and a lot of interest also in land value capture, which comes back to that important role for the land use planning system and the role of local governments in mandating through that. Negotiators still need to get things right on the dreaded, I hate to mention it, kind of Article 6 and everything that we hope will happen at COP26. Everybody's got their fingers crossed, but a lot of interest, not only from, from parties to the convention, but then also at subnational level, opportunities again for municipalities to then make use of carbon market mechanisms, then to kind of realize or monetize some of the kind of benefits of action to address climate change. So those are at the kind of farther end. But even down at the kind of lower capacity end, looking at opportunities for own source revenue collection, and we've seen interest in projects, for example, across sub-Saharan Africa. I know the CPI Finance Lab has looked at, the possibility of revenue collection for projects around municipal street lighting projects, for example, not just within one country, but across multiples, and just opportunities to explore there. And those would relate also to things like performance-based contracting, and opportunities to introduce service-based contracts for things like building energy efficiency, for street lighting, and other models, very much there in the middle. So there's really a whole array of instruments, and we're seeing a better understanding and kind of almost not quite typology, but that kind of approach of being able to understand the enabling conditions that are in place in particular countries or for particular cities, and then trying to match those to the most appropriate sets of financing instruments, and working with CCFLA through the Enabling Frameworks Action Group and through the Global Governance Finance Technical Working Group, really looking to explore opportunities both to promote awareness and technical capacity and capability around the use of these instruments through the city networks, through the regional covenants and others. And I've focused even then in those few minutes, I won't say anything more about the top kind of half of the graph. That was, kind of more on the revenue side and opportunities there. But then obviously around the city expenditure side that Sami also mentioned in his kind of introductory presentation, the role of public transportation fleets, opportunities through management of some of those basic urban functions really there. And again, on a scale from kind of lower to higher agency. So our understanding is increasing. The trick now is to be able to convert this into really practical, very immediately actionable information for cities, and to equip networks, including the Global Covenant and others, to then be able to roll that out as rapidly as possible.
Thank you so much, Andy. That's really good. overview of what can be done and what needs to happen. And again, certainly also as CCFLA and as the Alliance, we stand here to work with you and all the others to make sure that becomes more practical. But we are getting to the end of our session here, but I'm very happy now to hand back to Sami and just like ask you, Sami, for some reflecting remarks before I try to very briefly sum up what I've heard as key insights from today. So Sami, over to you.
Thank you, Barbara, and thanks to Andy for having done part of what I had wanted to share, which is to share the various instruments that could really expand, if you will, the pie. 3 quick points. One, whole of society approach, whole of an economy approach, city official needing to embed climate considerations at all levels of existing planning processes, the spatial, the capital investment plan, the municipal finance, the budget. National government creating that enabling environment and supporting also city level climate policy alignment. International organizations, IFIs, expanding project preparation support to help build that pipeline of projects. And in particular, the need to unlock the private sector, like Emmanuel mentioned. There's a perception of risk, that needs basically measurement, that needs information, and that needs also piloting investment with measures of credit enhancement, etc. So that's point number 1, whole of economy approach. Point number 2, there's a lot that can happen, and he covered that point super well. And there's a lot that can happen beyond just, if you will, pumping finance. It's structuring the finance, it's improving the planning, it's the land value capture, it's the greening the intergovernmental fiscal transfers. There's a great array that can happen as we are trying to unlock the finance. The third is partnerships, just like we are here today with UN Habitat, with CCFLA, GCOM, IPCC, the World Bank, the city networks, the Inter-American Development Bank. There's a lot that can happen in networks. Back to you, Barbara.
Thank you so much, Sami, and thank you so much to all my panelists. Let me just very briefly take a couple of minutes to try to summarize what I've heard from this very rich debate and lots of insights that I think we all can take away. I think just starting from the big picture, we are making progress, but we are falling far short of the needs. I think we see that the investments are there, but we really need to kind of address the barriers and the challenges that we've heard today. And I think what we've heard from our very esteemed panelists today is really ways in how we can do that, how we can address some of the challenges, and how different and what different actors can do to basically enable cities to mobilize finance and to really access resources. I think I'd start with really kind of the good planning. We've heard that again and again. I think good planning, really helping cities to have good climate action plans is key. And I think the second big issue that I've heard is capacity. Capacity on the technical side, really in making sure that the cities have the ways to structure projects, prepare projects, to monitor and comply with some of the requests, but also capacity to invest in people, in youth, and in really kind of the society that is behind cities and the future of the cities. I think that leads me also a little bit to the need to kind of still work on data and language. I think we need to have one language, we need to have the right metrics and monitor progress to really make sure that we can highlight the key role that cities have in addressing climate action. And that leads me to the point I think that both Andy and Sami now have brought out very nicely, but also Emmanuel in her example, innovation. I feel that there is a lot of innovation that we still need, both in regulations, but also in business models, in tools that really can help unlock more capital and really address the different perceptions of risk that still exist, also through blended finance, but also through bringing in other actors such as national development banks and insurance. And all that, I think, needs then to culminate in better information sharing, better knowledge sharing. We've heard the Knowledge Hub that Andy has mentioned. Also at CCFLA, we do have also a finance director where we try to help provide information to really access project preparation facilities. So I'll encourage you to also check that one out. It's not always easy to understand which facility is the best one for your needs, but we need to do even better there. And I think all that then brings me to certainly what we've heard again and again, partnerships. I think we need to have all the different actors from the multinational side, the national side, the MDBs, NDBs, cities, private sector, civil society, youth, city networks, but also analytic organizations like ours, really together and really make sure that we have this systemic level framework and the whole of a society approach that will enable us to really unlock capital at scale. So I think with that, just the final point, Marisa, I think it is important to think about how we communicate. So let's all think about how can we really make sure that national governments understand that they will not achieve their climate goals without cities, and that this is really a critical point for us all to work together. And so let's work together and let's turn the challenges that we've heard into opportunities by using all the insights from the day, but also to continue the working together. So let me thank all of my panelists, all of the organizers here for a fantastic session, and I look forward to continuing this conversation with all of you. Thank you so much. And back to Megan, sorry, I should have said that.
Thanks so much, Barbara, and thank you so much to all the panelists for this really insightful conversation. I'd like to spotlight Lulu again, the illustrator who's been capturing all these insights on how to leverage urban climate finance. Please, to all the participants, enjoy the final days of the conference. And remember that if there are any sessions that you couldn't get to, you feel free to replay these sessions afterwards, as they are available still on the website. Also, please take some time to visit the cinema space for some virtual field trips and other pre-recorded sessions. And if you haven't already done so, provide your one song to our conference playlist, and as well as your thoughts on any of the conference themes or missing voices, knowledge gaps, and surveys, and to the boards in the Knowledge Center. So our next live session will be starting here again in the plenary space, and is going to be starting again in 10 minutes. That will be to hear from our MENA regional curators. Remember to stick around for that. And if you have any other technical questions, please head over to the Help Center. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.